Is the Ukrainian top commander firing his subordinates for the crime of executing the strategy? Just why is the Ukrainian plan making the commander so angry, especially as it seems like Russia is increasingly faltering on the battlefield? I'm Paul, US Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So, this is an interesting story that's kind of a follow up to another post that we talked about from the Kiev Independent, where reportedly the commander in chief, General Syrskyi, has become increasingly Soviet in his tactical choices. Now, what's fascinating about this is that, well, fascinating and kind of grim, is that the previous story reported that oftentimes the Soviet mentality was sacrificing soldiers in exchange for even minor tactical advantages. And in the case of Syrskyi, that has meant sacrificing tremendous amounts of infantry to hold positions to the last man, simply to make Russian efforts to advance more difficult. And this has been really reflected in the recent dismissal of two high-level commanders, the 17th and 20th Army Corps. And this is the first senior personnel changes since Zelensky announced in February that the Ukrainian armed forces would move to a corps-based structure. And these are two corps commanders. Both commanders were reportedly moved about 2 weeks ago, following what they described as battlefield losses in the areas under their command. The 17th Corps was responsible for the front line south of Zaporizhia, where Ukrainian forces lost control of a village called Kamyanska and were partially driven out of Plavny, both along the Dnipro. The 20th Corps was between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, where Russian forces crossed in August, digging into the latter region for the first time. And what I think is, now this article talks about, these this core system command structure that supposedly is going to be more efficient. But the overstretched character of Ukraine's army along hundreds of kilometers and the lack of strategic reserve mean that reorganizing units' sectors is kind of impossible because, well, you can't simply pull people out and put them into new places because, well, you can't actually abandon a sector. The best you can probably do is keep the sector online and move who the units are assigned to, but doing that mid-attack or mid-defense is actually really, really hard. But more fundamental is that reportedly these commanders were actually fired because they misreported the actual status of infantry and territory being held. And this is something that has been discussed, is that for a lot of these Ukrainian units, there is a massive shortage of infantry. And the truth is that these infantry formations aren't actually the ones holding the line. In a lot of cases, the so-called gray zone within the battlefield is much deeper even than is depicted here. So typically, from what I've heard in other reporting, that the gray zone can span up to 10 kilometers. This is areas that essentially, think of it as drone no man's land, where you have to cross a wall of FPV drones, reconnaissance drones, ground drones, just to find a Ukrainian position. And then, only then, once you find that position, can the Russians engage them and try to drive them out. And this has actually proven a very efficient strategy for the Ukrainians. And a lot of commanders, not by choice, but by force, simply by having so few infantrymen that they say, listen, I can't put an infantryman right here. Like, he's too valuable. We have too few of them. So instead, they say, listen, we're going to put them back here, and we're going to make these Russians cross drone after drone after drone. But what does that mean? That means if you could map where a Russian actually is throughout the day, what you would have is an assault team, dozens of assault teams crossing into these regions. Some of them are blown up. Some of them get turned around. Some of them make it far in, but they all end up getting ground down. And then the next day, the Russians are back, and they send another two-man team this way or that way, trying to probe and find those Ukrainian positions. And so the real front line, right, is the no man's land is just simply deeper than anyone could have expected. Instead of simply a whistle-blown charge up over the hill like World War I, what you have instead is two dudes who are told simply, hey, wander until you get killed or until you find a Ukrainian position, which itself has only 1 to 2 people in it. And so this reality is something, though, the problem is that sometimes Russia makes these advances, right? They might move a couple kilometers forward and then dig in. And that's technically lost territory. And so Now, to Ukrainian commanders, they say, listen, it's not lost territory because it's simply no man's land. They're just getting closer to this no man's land. But to you, when Ukrainians' high command's priority is preserving territory, because as they perceive it, every square inch that Russia advances is going to be something that is probably going to get frozen in place in any kind of peace deal, right? So that is the political incentive here. But the issue is that it's a little bit of like a company going bankrupt to make sure they pay a quarterly dividend, where yes, in the short term, it is probably good to see the Ukrainian forces delay Russian advances. But in the long term, what's really going to help them is simply killing a lot of Russians. And as we've talked about, that is honestly a better strategy here, is to maximize Russian casualties to create a politically untenable situation within Russia. As we've talked about on this channel, as North Koreans found, or North Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese never won an engagement against the United States. Not once. The United States, if they wanted to hold a region or hold a base, no North Vietnamese attack was ever able to dislodge them. And yet, eventually, the U.S. simply became exhausted. They had taken too many casualties. They expended too many resources. In fact, they literally had to alter how their very currency was structured. Nixon had to close the gold window because the U.S. was so badly in debt from the Vietnam War that was the actual path to victory all along. And so when you're talking about targeting Russia, the actual path to victory is not whether or not they take Pokrovsk in 6 months or in a year, right? Which is what we've seen. We've seen Russia just comically small, comically low in terms of their advance in Donetsk. But instead, the actual win against Russia is not going to be whether they advance at 100 meters a day or 200 meters a day. It's going to be whether or not the Russian political system and the Russian economic system can sustain 3 years of high intensity combat. And that is the actual path to victory. And one of the things I want to point out is that it seems like it's working, right? Russia claims to be hitting these massive recruitment numbers, but look, their key regions, their key fights in Donetsk, look, we're seeing more and more Ukrainian forces actually roll Russia back. Not everywhere, but in a lot of key areas. Again, we're seeing some Russian advances in other parts of the front, sure, near Yampil and Seversk, but to me, the more interesting takeaway is, again, the fact that these Russian forces are looking increasingly cut off, pieced apart, unable to be relieved by other Russian forces. And this is the Russian ground zero. This is the main effort here. And for all of their effort, for hundreds of thousands of lives, they still haven't taken even Pokrovsk. And again, when I was in Ukraine nearly a year ago, they were still like, Pokrovsk is under threat. The Russians are going to take Pokrovsk any day now. And here we are a year later, and the city still stands. So again, I think there's also a lesson here that the Ukrainians were willing to make those sort of trade-offs when the U.S. was willing to endorse them. And now, without U.S. assistance in planning and executing, and U.S. intelligence sharing, right, the Ukrainians are probably increasingly relying on tried and true tactics that feel safe and comfortable and known, and in this case, extremely, extremely Soviet. Do you guys want to help the Ukrainians defend Kramatorsk in the east? Well, Ukraine ADOPS has partnered with the best brigades in the Ukrainian military to hold the line in the east. They need drones. They need antennas. They need everything we can get them to keep the Russians at bay. So that's what we're doing. We're working with Ukraine ADOPS for their Fortress Kramatorsk fundraiser. And best of all, there is an anonymous donor who has said he will match, or I don't know, will match up to $300,000 of donations. So every dollar we raise for them is going to be another dollar from our anonymous donor. So if you want to help out the 93rd, the 25th, Azov, the 79th, the 82nd, and the boys of Liu, most of which I've met, actually, you want to click the link in the description and get the fundraiser. Plus, they give you guys some sweet hookups, $250, get you a patch of the Kramatorsk patrol police, which is pretty sick. And 2 gets you actually that patch plus patch from Corvus, the Corvus drone unit of the 93rd. These are literally some of the best drone pilots in the entire Ukrainian military. You can see honestly, I think it's just badass that their official unit patch has a quadcopter drone. I actually had, when I came back, a friend of all the like patches I was given. One of my buddies was like, "That is the coolest patch I've ever seen." So check it out. The link's in the description. And of course, a huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, guys like Yanko, Georgiev, Bastian, Himmerling, Michael Fry, Christian Schumann, Chris Holmes, Deborah Oppenheimer, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. We couldn't do it without you. Hit that subscribe. See you in the next one. Cheers.